we will not recognise the end of democracy when it comes. Advanced democracies are not overthrown. There are no tanks on the street, no sudden catastrophes, no brash dictators or braying mobs. Instead, their institutions are imperceptibly drained of everything that once made them democratic. The labels will still be there, but they will no longer describe the contents. The facade will still stand, but there will be nothing behind it. The rhetoric of democracy will be unchanged, but it will be meaningless, and the fault will be ours.
Your general thesis is the state is overplaying its hand, that it's using coercion or whatever, it's using its powers inappropriately. But again, let's just have a look at that in a little bit more detail. And I want to take you to Trials of the State now, the book you wrote around your Leith lectures. And in it, you use an example of when the state used its resources backed by an electorate, and the quote was, for the benign purpose of improving the lot of humanity. And you're referring to the 1945 Labour government. And I think you're making the point that states can, where they have the support of the electorate and where they have good purpose, etc., they can exert the powers that they have. Now, is that not the same here? We have a state mobilizing its resources, not using very much coercion, we've agreed, nothing like on the scale of the war, and for the benign purpose of improving the lot of humanity, which would be trying to avoid the loss of tens of thousands of people. And there's no question, supported by the overwhelming majority of the electorate, whether judged by their representatives in Parliament or by opinion polls. It's the ending of the lockdown that's proving unpopular, not the lockdown. So by what criteria then do you have to say that they are overplaying their hand and went beyond what their democratic powers might be?
Well, I don't think that their purpose is benign. I quite agree that public health is a benign purpose, but as I've sought to point out, the collateral costs are extremely high. And one of the problems is that the government has not actually weighed up pros and cons. They have simply said, this is a potential public health disaster. They haven't asked themselves the only question that matters until quite recently, namely, is it worth it? There's no indication that they asked themselves that question until very late in the day. The Prime Minister is reputed to have said, when he was told about the scale of unemployment, destruction of our gross domestic product, and so on in the early June, gripes. Well now, what on earth did you think was going to happen? And the answer is he doesn't seem to have thought about it at all, at least not so far as the public record shows. So I don't accept that this is a benign question. I think that there are pluses and minuses, and that the minuses greatly outweigh the pluses.
Well, let me put you on the spot.
But
then.
I mean, on the public opinion point, you are quite right that at the outset there was overwhelming public support for it. Public support is probably still a majority, but it's a good deal smaller majority than it was. I think that my point is not just a criticism of the government, it's also a criticism of my fellow citizens. Because the problem really is that governments with popular support can do very, very oppressive things, and some of them are very wicked things. I'm not necessarily describing this in that way, but the danger with despots is precisely that they appeal to public opinion to do things which, in the cold light of day and by any objective standard, look absolutely appalling. Now, I don't think, therefore, that the mere fact that the public is in favour of it is a good enough reason. But you're quite right to say, and it's really the implication of this, that if I'm criticising the government, I ought to be criticising my fellow citizens for supporting the government, and I do. But I will actually say this as well, which is that the government has to a large extent created its own public opinion by what I regard as an extremely exaggerated PR process. This is Boris Johnson's Project Fear. And what he has sought to do is to achieve compliance by encouraging fear for the first 6 to 8 weeks of this crisis. And by doing, I mean, fear is infectious, just like epidemics.
Yes.
And by doing that, he has achieved a high degree of compliance, but he's now learning the cost of that. He's now trying to say, well, let's all go back to work. And people are naturally asking themselves, well, I thought you said this was the most terrible disaster in waiting that there ever was. What's changed? The honest answer to that question would be, nothing's changed. It just wasn't true in the first place. But of course, governments, except for the Norwegian governments, they're very rarely honest enough to say that.
In your Nick Robertson interview, you did come slightly close to saying that you might covertly break the law, and in your closing remarks about what you and your wife might do.
Yes, I did. I mean, as I said in answer to a question at the end of my very first Reith lecture, I don't accept that there is a moral obligation to obey the law simply because it is the law. I think that there are a number of considerations here. I think that you owe it to your fellow citizens to respect the law in circumstances where there is a common loyalty to the way in which the law was made. And what critically matters is, how was the law made? Is it made in a democratically accountable fashion? I have serious criticisms, which I've expressed in the media, about the way in which the various decisions of the government on COVID-19 were made. I don't think that they were made with any great care. I think that they were made under an extremely loosely drafted statute, the meaning of which is not by any means clear. And so I don't have a great deal of respect for the way in which this particular law was made. But ultimately, everybody is entitled, as it seems to me, morally entitled to say, I am not prepared to obey this law. I recognize that I must take the consequences if I am found out, but I'm not prepared to. The collateral effects of a lockdown are really very serious. This isn't just a public health issue. It's a political issue. It involves weighing the public health factors against other considerations, the education of our children, the prosperity of our society, on which, after all, we depend for our ability to combat any kind of epidemic diseases, and other effects on health, effects, for example, on mental health, on cancer deaths. There is more to life than the avoidance of death, and if the cost of being alive is to suppress everything that is worth it, then my view is that the cost is simply too high.